So here's a quick overview of Chapter 1, the science of psychology. You're going to first be looking at what defines psychology as a field of study, what makes it unique amongst other like areas, and what are its four primary goals when we talk about doing psychology. And just a little hint is that it has to do with research and critical thinking. Okay, so this chapter is really all about the discipline of psychology, what makes it a science. You're going to take a little bit of a trip through history, looking at where psychology has been, where it's come from, and where it's ended up today. We'll look at structuralism versus functionalism, which are just different ideas on how the mind works, how the brain works. These were early pioneers in psychology trying to figure out where the mind fit as a construct in trying to study it. And who were some of those important people in those early days. What were some of the basic ideas behind the who, behind all those people? What ideas did they have, and what were some of the early approaches? You'll be introduced to Gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, and behaviorism. And the latter two especially are going to come up again and again throughout the semester as we talk about the different areas of psychology. You might want to take a quick little detour and just check out the table of contents in your book. That's always a great place to just kind of look at what are the topics, and you're going to see all the main areas in psychology. So psychology as a discipline is big, it's broad, and there are many sub areas within psychology. And so we normally think of things like counseling psychology or clinical psychology, developmental, cognitive, learning, memory, physiological psych, health psych, social psych. Those are all areas within psychology that kind of went their own direction but fall under the umbrella of psych. And some of the key sort of umbrella theories over that would be Gestalt, psychoanalysis, and behaviorism. And then we're going to talk about some key players, Skinner, Maslow, and Rogers. Were really big there with behaviorism and humanistic psychology. What do those mean? They contribute to part of the 7 modern perspectives on psychology. So the chapter starts out kind of taking you through a history of where psychology's been to today. What are different perspectives that people have in psychology. So not every psychologist looks at a situation or a person the same. There are different lenses, if you will, that we can view reasons for behavior or reasons for psychopathy or mental illness. There are different takes on maybe what contributed to those things. How much of it was environment, how much of it was genes, how much of it has to do with parenting versus our physiology. So depending upon where you lie, some people place more emphasis on certain things than other things. It doesn't make any one thing wrong or right. It's just where people feel most compelled or most interested that they want to kind of study and look at, and that's where we get all the different areas of psychology. You'll look at what differs between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, as well as other types of professionals who work within the areas of psychology. We hear lots of names out there, lots of different fields and subfields, counseling and research realms. So you'll kind of parse through some of those. You'll look at why psychology is considered a science. And here's where the chapter turns from sort of the history of psych into the research methodology used in psych. We'll look at scientific method. This is basically a recipe for how we set up studies. You can do those in many different ways. You'll look at naturalistic studies, laboratory studies that are basically used to describe behavior. And then what some of the advantages and disadvantages are to those. And then look at case studies and surveys. Those are also ways used to describe a behavior, describe what a group of people are doing or a person is doing. What are the drawbacks maybe to those? Correlational technique, that tells you about relationships. How does one thing relate to another? How do they correlate? This gives us a little more information, but it also describes behavior. It describes two things, like we think of like income and ethnicity as being two things that we could correlate to see if they go together and how that might happen. And then we start to get a little more specific in trying to determine cause of behavior, cause and effect relationships, and that's done with the experimentation method. And so here we get into operational definitions, we get into different variables that we use when we talk about experimentation. There's something we're measuring, and then there's something that we're changing to see, hey, if I change this, how does it affect this that I'm measuring? So if I change the temperature in a classroom, might it change the grades that students get? I'm measuring their grades, right, or their IQ or their GPA, but I'm changing something. I'm putting maybe some students in a cold classroom and some in a warm classroom, and then I'm going to see how does that affect them. So those are your variables at play, and we have different groups that we're looking at, experimental and control groups. We might randomly assign people to different groups. So all of those are elements of an experiment. There are some really great videos embedded in Revel as you're going to be watching that help explain some of this, as well as the videos I've posted for you in Plato on experimentation. It really just helps give you an idea of what these different groups are and how are they operating differently. You'll also look at placebo and experimenter effects. Those can kind of throw a wrench in experimentation sometimes because people don't always act in ways that are consistent with what we would think. And a lot of times feelings and expectations can get in the way. So we try to control for this through single and double blind studies, so you'll learn a little bit about what those mean. And then we'll end with some ethical concerns for conducting research. This is the subject of your discussion this week, as well as what are the basic principles of critical thinking and why is critical thinking important? How is it different from just regular old thinking? And how can we use it in everyday life? And that sums up your objectives for Chapter 1.